Good afternoon and welcome to Talks at Google in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today it is my truly great pleasure to introduce Dr. Barry M. Prizant. I've been looking forward to this talk for months. Barry's CV is really too extensive to list here short form. Since 1998, he's been Director of Childhood Communication Services, CCS, a private practice, and serves as Adjunct Professor in the Center for the Study of Human Development at Brown University. He has published more than 120 articles and chapters on autism, childhood communication disorders, and child development, has given more than 700 seminars and workshops at national and international conferences. He served on the editorial board of 6 scholarly journals and writes a regular column for Autism Spectrum Quarterly. In our book today, Uniquely Human, Dr. Prizant offers a compelling new approach. The most successful approaches to autism don't aim to fix a person by eliminating symptoms, but instead seek to understand the individual's experience and what underlies the behavior. I picked this book up expecting to skim it and wound up reading every word. I believe it's one of the most remarkable books about the human condition I've ever read. Please join me in welcoming Barry Prizant.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, and it's really a pleasure to be here, and good afternoon to you all. Thanks for coming. What I'm going to be talking about, in essence, is my life's work, going back to when I was a teenager. And I'll talk a little bit about the path that I took, but the path that I've taken in a way mirrors, and I hope we could say that maybe the work that I've done with some of my colleagues, it is also very close to the path that our understanding of autism has taken. And that's what my relatively short talk will do for you today as we move ahead, and that is talk about this concept of looking at people with autism as uniquely human and trying to move away from the more traditional views, especially over the last 50, 60, 70 years, 70 years ago when autism was first diagnosed, or if you will, described by Lee O'Connor. There's been a very interesting path, and in my career, I've been a part of that because it's my 46th year in the field, if you will, if you count the start that I had at summer camps, and I'll be talking about that a little bit. So there I am, just to prove that I do go back this far. This was a camp for kids who were labeled with emotional behavioral disorders in 1971. It was 2 years after Woodstock, and yes, I really was there. And many of these boys had other diagnoses, primarily in terms of emotional or behavioral problems. And many of you are aware of, we now talk about the autism spectrum and how much that category has expanded. Today, when I look at these boys, and it seems like yesterday, I would think that at least half of these boys today would get a diagnosis on the autism spectrum, whereas back then, I think one of these boys had a diagnosis with autism. I want to focus on 3 issues for the time that we have. The first issue is the importance of understanding the behavior of people with autism, and ASD, if you don't know, is autism spectrum disorder. What are some of their challenges and their experiences? And in particular, we're going to talk about how people have described and have looked at behavioral patterns. And I will add to that, have probably misunderstood a lot of the patterns of behavior that have been documented over the years, and that are even still used in diagnosing autism. I want to talk also about the belief that autism is simply nothing but a tragedy for the child and a tragedy for the family. It still lingers out there, especially in mainstream settings, mainstream public, and a lot of advocacy organizations continue to promote this notion of autism as tragedy because it's a way that you raise money. If you say, wait a second, maybe that is a wrong descriptor. You know, maybe there are people with autism and families, despite the challenges, who are doing very well, thank you. But I'm going to be talking about how many kids I've followed over the years. I'll be talking about the fact that for 20 years, we've been doing a weekend parent retreat for parents of children and adults with autism. And it's really hard to find families who just say, you know, this has been just nothing but a tragedy. As a matter of fact, very often we hear the reverse. I'm not saying many, but some parents actually say, if we could turn back time and I could make it so that my child did not have autism, would I do it? And some parents actually say no, that they feel they've lived life more deeply because of the experience of raising a person with autism and of connecting with other people in the community of families that have a family member with autism. And we're going to finish up a little bit talking about the belief, again, I think it's a false belief in a sense, that autism is only within a child or a person. If any of you have a family member or a neighbor who has a diagnosis of autism, you know it has probably influenced your life. And sometimes in challenging ways, but sometimes in very positive ways as well. So this notion of autism just being within a person, we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we move ahead. You know, I think of it this way. There's a quiet revolution going on. And not too much of that revolution has really hit the mainstream yet. And what is that revolution? The revolution is that we're beginning to look at autism and people with autism as uniquely human, as opposed to a bunch of symptoms or a pathological condition, or that autism is the only thing that we see when we see a person who has that diagnosis. That many of you know, it's kind of an old adage now, that once you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And that people with autism are as different from each other as I am from every person in this room. And that's important because different people with autism have different talents, different passions, different types of relationships with people. But what's happened with kind of this stereotypic notion of the person or the child with autism, quote unquote, in his own little world, or not being interested in people, is that stereotype has really taken hold, unfortunately, in the mainstream public. And a point I want to make right now is it really has inhibited possibilities for people with autism. So let me just give you a quick example. There's a young man, and just for confidentiality reasons, I'm not going to mention specific names, but he's a young man who went to school in Boston at the Berklee School of Music. World famous jazz pianist, okay? And I know the family, and I've known this young man for many years, and just graduated from another renowned school of music in New York City, has 10 CDs, travels the world playing jazz piano. And yet in speaking with his mom said to me, you know, he's having trouble getting a job, the type of job he would really love to have, because as soon as people hear the word autism, they run the other way. And here is a person who's incredibly successful and is probably one of the most engaging, polite, just wonderful people you ever want to meet. So we still have that stigma out there, and this is what we're trying to kind of work against. So that quiet revolution that's going on is being led by parents, and it's being led by people who have autism. There's a group now out of Washington that's known as the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and they are lobbying constantly for legislation. They are lobbying for public policy that recognizes people with autism as whole people. Yes, challenges go with autism, and they're very open about that. But they're trying to change the perception as well. I've been fortunate enough to know some of these people. Actually, last month out in Denver, I shared an hour with one of the officers of this organization, and she did a beautiful job talking about how when you see us more as whole people, how that opens up possibilities for us. But as long as we go with the old stereotypes, doors are literally slammed in our face, and we can't move on from there. So let me just give you a little bit of some of this change that's happening in this revolution. Some of you may have heard the term autistic behavior. Raise your hand if you have. Have you heard that term before? Okay, that person has a lot of autistic behavior, or look at that autistic behavior. And it's such a wide range of patterns, everything from rocking to flapping when excited, to jumping up and down, to, in some cases, doing the same thing over and over again the same way, which is known as perseverative behavior. And one of the points that I make in Uniquely Human by looking at different patterns of behavior is, now wait a second, this is all human behavior. that we engage in very similar patterns, sometimes for very similar reasons. Okay? However, very often we know not to do it in front of other people. Okay? Or we may not do it as persistently, but we'll be talking about the fact that such patterns of behavior often serve an emotional regulatory function, that it helps us when we're feeling a little bit stressed, or such patterns of behavior may help us when we feel we need to concentrate. So I see a young person right here, kind of stroking her hair. You know, when a child does it who has autism, oh, we got to stop that autistic behavior. But how many of you stroke your hair or kind of scratch your beard or engage in those kinds of patterns of behavior, which sometimes helps us to stay regulated emotionally or helps us focus our energy a little bit more? And if we had time, I can give you more than a dozen or two examples of patterns of behavior that when a person with autism does it, it's considered a sign of pathology. But, you know, when we do it, well, it's just what we do. We spoke briefly about the notion of tragedy, and the depathologizing of autism is now looking at people being different. We do know, and there's almost 4 decades of research on this, that people with autism have different patterns of learning strengths, and there are extreme learning differences. Most people, I don't want to stereotype again, but most people with autism are much stronger visual processors than they are processors of auditory language. Okay? So that's one example, and if you're familiar with educational programs, at least well-designed educational programs for people with autism, we use visual supports persistently in all settings rather than conveying information primarily by talking. And that has to do with the visual strengths, processing, the strong visual memory as well. What for years has been called obsessions or obsessive behavior, now, as part of this revolution, we're talking about this as enthusiasms or passions. People now with autism say, don't talk about my obsessions, talk about my deep interests. And again, we could look at ourselves, and probably many of you have hobbies that you can describe as your deep interests. And some of what you do may appear very strange to other people, okay? So personally, many years ago, I started doing a lot of workshops up in Canada, and I became fascinated with Inuit carvings. So I have a whole china cabinet at home with more than 100 pieces of walrus ivory carved into various figures and just some rough cut, not carved into anything at all. And you could look at that and say, that's strange. This guy just has all these pieces of ivory. And by the way, that's all legally obtained ivory by Inuit folks. It's part of what they do to make a living in their art. But that could be considered pretty strange. I have a place, my family has a place, luckily, down by the coast of Rhode Island. And I like to take a bike ride every day. It's my exercise. And I've gotten into this pattern this summer that every time I take a bike ride and I stop at Moonstone Beach, I have to find a nice, smooth, white rock. And I line them up on the banister in front of my house. And when I look at it, it makes me feel good. It looks nice, and it tells me I've done a lot of bike riding this summer. So we see such patterns in people with autism, but in many cases, if they're not understood, they're considered to be a sign of pathology. And in some cases, people say we have to stop that. We have to break that particular pattern. People with autism for so many years were thought of as insensitive, oblivious to the environment, oblivious to the world, oblivious to other people. And now we're seeing, especially as people with autism could talk about their experiences, that they're highly sensitive. Not all, but many people with autism are highly sensitive on a sensory level in terms of auditory sensitivity, sensitivity to touch, which is known as tactile defensiveness. In many of our sensory modalities, people with autism are hypersensitive and hyperreactive. But it's not just in the sensory modalities, which I think we hear a lot about, especially with Temple Grandin talking about that and other famous people with autism. Now we're finding that people with autism are very sensitive to other people, that when other people talk about them in disparaging or negative ways, it's hurtful to them. They may not be able to express that. And so that's a huge turnaround, you know, compared to our original descriptions of autism in the 1940s and 1950s, where people with autism and kids with autism were thought of in a world of their own, unaware of what's going on around them. Now, on the surface, it may look that way if a child is averting gaze, or is engaged in an activity that he or she wants to do over and over again. But good teachers of kids with autism know that very often, even though a child is sitting in the classroom and doesn't appear to be watching or processing, there's a good chance that that student is. Okay? So when we have these pathological descriptions which still linger, even though we're moving away from it, what is the ultimate goal of treatment or education? You need to change people with autism. Okay? Now the shift that we're beginning to see, and I'm going to quote a very dear friend of mine who has Asperger's. He has a son with Asperger's. His name is Michael John Carley. Wrote a wonderful book, Asperger's from the Inside Out. And what I've learned from Michael, because so much of what I've learned have come from people with autism and from parents, what I've learned from Michael is if you want to help a person with autism, don't try to change them directly. The best way to help a person with autism is to change what we do and to change our behavior and our attitudes. Now that could happen on an individual level, but now we're saying that needs to happen on a societal level. That if we create the possibilities, if we understand why people with autism do certain things that might appear unconventional, or maybe we don't understand, that leads to us being more compassionate. The word we used to use is tolerant, and I like to use the word, now we can appreciate why they do that and understand, well, it may look different, but it's not so different than the types of things that we all do as human beings to stay well-regulated emotionally and to try to navigate through this craziness that we call our lives. So, another thing I want to bash right away, which I just alluded to a few moments ago, is that people with autism don't have caring relationships and don't care about people. This is my buddy Justin. This is a number of years ago. You could see him a little bit more gray now. But I hadn't seen Justin. I diagnosed Justin when he was 3. And I knew his family for many years. They lived in the Providence area, and then they moved to New Jersey. So I was only seeing Justin about, once a year, maybe twice a year, when his family would come up, or I would just see him in another place. I hadn't seen Justin for over a year. And Justin's an artist, and he was showing some of his art in a gallery in New York City. And when he saw me, this is what he did. He ran over to me and just gave me probably the best hug I ever had in my life. Okay? And Barry, it's so good to see you. Barry, you are my best friend in the world. And he's saying it with passion, and he's saying it with sincerity. So we're really getting away from this notion, which, so many parents have known for so many years. But unfortunately, it's one of those stereotypes that people with autism don't have caring relationships with others. So, why are we talking about people with autism being uniquely human? First of all, and I'm going to reiterate a little bit what I've been talking about, that behavior in autism has been misunderstood and sometimes dehumanized. Even deep interests and strengths have been pathologized in some cases, and what do you have to do? You have to reduce them or eliminate them. And we judge behavior as inappropriate according to these strict norms of what appropriate behavior is in a social context. One of the things I love to do, because I do a lot of school consulting, is when I'm asked to observe a child with autism, and that child is with a lot of so-called typical kids, and we might see the child with autism rocking or tapping their chin, I always like to broaden my lens, and let's say it's a 3rd grade class. I see half the kids in the class engaging in repetitive behaviors and doing things as well. And it's no different, okay? But again, when we know a person has that label of autism, then all of a sudden we have all this baggage that we attach to it. So I'm just going to go through this very quickly. Some common descriptions. All of these descriptions are from the literature, the educational literature, as well as the research literature over the years. Non-compliant, stubborn, manipulative, rude, bizarre, avoidant, deviant, challenging, obsessive, self-stimulatory, non-functional, meaningless, irrelevant, that's speech in particular, perseverative, and non-communicative. And by the way, by training, I'm a psycholinguist before I went on in speech and language pathology. And so the way I looked at language and actually studied echolalia, the tendency to repeat speech, for my doctoral dissertation, was not just to stay at that level of form, but to dig very deeply into the semantics and the pragmatics of how language was used. And I was able to demonstrate that what was considered to be meaningless and irrelevant language in my dissertation research and subsequent research was language that was very meaningful, okay? And in many cases unconventional, but still very meaningful. And guess what? When you speak to parents, they very often have deciphered the meanings. It's almost like a private dialect that families often have. And it's not just about spoken language, even nonverbal behavior, even subtleties of nonverbal behavior, parents pick up as meaningful because they see their child or their family member in so many contexts, and they see what it means. So this notion of autism as a tragedy, certainly from very early on, right after Lee O'Connor first described the notion of autism, that it was described that way in the psychiatric literature. 10 years ago, there was a book, well-known book in the history of autism, called Evidence of Harm, in which the author David Kirby was trying to make links between autism and vaccinations. And many of you know, you all know, how controversial that issue is. But in his description of what autism is, in the introduction to his book, this is a quote, he said, "Autism is a lost, hellish world." Okay? And you say, well, that's 10 years ago. Things have changed, haven't they, Barry? Robert Kennedy Jr., a few months ago, initially referred to autism as a holocaust. And when people really protested, especially people from the Jewish community, really protested that he used the word Holocaust, this was his apology. I employ the term Holocaust as I struggle to find an expression to convey the catastrophic tragedy of autism, which has now destroyed the lives of over 20 million children and shattered their families. And when I first heard that, I'm thinking about, oh my goodness, I don't think you know the families that I know. I don't think you know the people and the children with autism that I know, if this is what you think. But obviously a person like Robert Kennedy Jr. has a bully pulpit, and this is what's emanating out to the public. This is what the public is hearing. Whereas so many parents I know, and these are quotes from my book, my 28-year-old son with autism is the best human being I know. Another dad said, I learn to live every day from my son who has autism. And so we're hearing very, very different versions of the experience of autism. And let me give you some examples. A mom who has a blog and who has a 9-year-old son. Welcome to our little corner of the world. Some call it autism, others call it despair and sorrow. I happen to call it hope, beauty, and fascination. John Elder Robinson, who's a Massachusetts native, very well known for his book, Look Me in the Eye. Asperger's is not a disease, it's a way of being. There is no cure, nor is there a need for one. There is, however, a need for knowledge. And what he means by that is a need for understanding us. Okay? And this was a father speaking at our retreat. The people who have been most helpful to us are those who do not take away our hope. We have learned to keep away from the doom and gloom crowd. And that's another, I'm kind of simplifying it, but that's another dichotomy that we see now. The doom and gloom crowd about autism still is a tragedy, and we have to do everything to find the cure, as opposed to autism is a different way of being in this world. And yes, there are considerable challenges that vary from mild to extreme, but we feel it's much more productive to look at it that way. So, what have we learned from experience and from research? Once again, there's no such thing as autistic behavior. It is all human behavior. And that a lot of patterns that are considered to be autistic behavior are best understood as reactions to this crazy world, reactions to confusion and stress and anxiety, and are often attempts to communicate and cope. So, for example, we do know that people with autism often protest in unconventional ways. So if a child is asked to go into a very busy, noisy cafeteria, he or she may drop to the floor right on the threshold of going through the door. Now, you could say that's autistic behavior or bad behavior, or you could say that, you know, that's the way she protests because she doesn't have the language, or maybe she's not using a speech-generating device yet to be able to say, no, thank you, it's crazy in there, okay? So what we're learning is that all behavior is communication, and a lot of behavior we see in people with autism that was pathologized now serves a lot of different communicative purposes and functions. And it's our job as parents, as therapists, as teachers, even as neighbors, to be able to connect and help people with autism to communicate more successfully and to be more in the flow of life with us. So we need to ask why, okay? And another thing that's been that big turnaround is that we now have so many people with autism telling us that when you allow me to focus on my deep interests, that's a wellspring of opportunity for me. It may end up being a vocation. It may end up being a hobby. It might be the way that I connect with other kids in an after-school club in high school. But please don't put down my deep interests. And we have a chapter called Enthusiasms in the book Uniquely Human, and I'll just tell you about a couple of them right now, how amazing they are in some kids. I met a family that had a 9-year-old son with autism, and this was in Virginia, about a year and a half ago. And after I gave a little talk, the mom came up to me and said, "I love how you use the word enthusiasms." And I didn't invent it, by the way. A mother, a very well-known mother, Clara Claiborne Park, who was at Williams College for many years, and she has a daughter with autism who's an artist. She came up with the word enthusiasms to replace obsessions. But this mom said to me, "You know what my son's enthusiasm is?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "Spices." I said, "Spices?" "Well, he loves to line up all the spices in my spice cabinet in alphabetical order." And not only that, but he's an expert on barbecues, regional barbecues in the United States, from North Carolina to Texas barbecue to on, and he could tell you what the differences are in the spices in 10 different barbecue varieties around the country, 9 years of age. And then she said very proudly, "You know, and he loves to watch cooking shows, and I think he's going to be a chef." Okay? So that's a good example of a passion or an enthusiasm that we would say is interesting, and maybe society would value that. Okay? But there are also very different passions and enthusiasms that we have to kind of shape and help people with autism to, if you will, use in their lives in ways that they are valued. Okay, just what might be considered some autistic behavior, some quick slides. Here's a little guy. He wasn't yet diagnosed. He was diagnosed at 6 years of age with Asperger's. He's 3 here. And his mom gave me this photo, hypersensitive to sound. Didn't help, and very often if he didn't have pot lids, I don't know how effective those are, he would cover his ears. Here's a young man, 8 years of age, who when he got tired at the end of the day, sees in his pajamas, he would put his body in this position, and the technical term is he's increasing vestibular input and proprioceptive input, which is very alerting to your neurological system. And he would do things like this whenever he was tired at the end of the day, almost like a toddler, running in circles when they don't want to go to sleep. And this is not a young man with autism. This is my son 10 years ago, who's a so-called neurotypical child. Okay? We're about to send him off to Wash U in next week. My only son's going off to college. But yeah, typical kids engage in autistic behaviors. What do you think about that? And persistently in some cases. When he was tired as a baby, well, as a toddler, he would sit at the dinner table and go, "Ooh." I have all these videos. I could show literally edited segments of videos of my son, and people in the field of autism would say, "How old is that child with autism?" Yeah. This is very interesting. A few years ago, when I did office assessments, which I don't do now, I mostly consult out, we had just done a team assessment on a second grader with autism, had a little bit of speech, not much, and echoed a lot, repeated a lot of what he heard to communicate. And we were sitting with his parents, and we were giving his parents some feedback. We were talking about what Eric's strengths were and the areas we really want to work on with Eric. And we gave him a little tin of markers and some paper. And we saw he was kind of persistently taking one marker, writing something down, putting it back in, taking another colored marker, writing it down. But we weren't watching what he was doing. He ended up filling up 3 sheets of paper with these sequences and patterns of numbers. And his mother said, "Oh yeah, when he does it in school, they say it's perseverative behavior and he has to stop it." When we saw him do it, there was absolutely no doubt. He was doing it to stay grounded, to stay emotionally well-regulated, because he wanted to be with us and with his parents, But he needed to tolerate all these adults talking quickly back and forth to each other, which was probably difficult for him on an auditory stimulation level to deal with. But this is absolutely brilliant. There are all kinds of patterns in there that he just came up with spontaneously. So, how can we refute this autism is a tragedy belief? First of all, build understanding. And this is so important for parents. Parents crave hearing the positives, as do persons with autism. And a piece of it is depathologizing these types of patterns of behavior. Okay? In my book, I tell a story of a child whose father, for Christmas, had bought her a bumble ball. You know what a bumble ball is? It's a rubber ball that has little spiky things on it, and it has a motor on the inside. When you turn it on, it vibrates. And his dad was so happy that he had bought this for his 4-year-old daughter. But when I visited the home for the first time, he said to me, "Was this the wrong thing to do, buying this ball for my daughter for Christmas?" And I said, "I can't see how that would be wrong." And he said to me, "Well, his therapist said it's just going to increase her autistic behavior, and you really shouldn't buy things like that." And it devastated the dad. And if you think about it, it's basically saying to the dad, your intuitions about your daughter are wrong. We discuss this a lot in the book, how often parents' intuitions about their child, which are very often reasonable and right on, our parents are told, no, you shouldn't be doing that, or you should extinguish that behavior. You have to discourage that interest. And it still happens, unfortunately. We want to respond with compassion. Too often, people with autism and parents are feeling that they're blamed. One of the biggest challenges right now in autism is mental health issues as people move on past the elementary school years. A lot of depression, a lot of feeling I'm stupid, feeling I'm lousy, because they're getting that kind of feedback from other people, when in many cases, these are very, very bright, engaging individuals, but they're misunderstood. Expressing appreciation. We want to create positive images of people with autism and celebrate successes. And then, of course, providing support, highlighting the strength that people show, because one of the characteristics of autism is peaks and valleys. I'm not saying every person with autism has great talents or great savant skills, but certainly we see the peaks and valleys, which creates some of that mysteriousness when somebody sees a child. So we want to provide a more realistic, balanced perspective. So when we think about autism only being within the child, which I refer to as the disease model of autism, then progress is about recovering the child from autism, changing the behavior, so we no longer see, if you will, those symptoms that are listed as diagnostic criteria. And some people still say, we recover kids from autism, we make them normal, but as a dad once said to me, isn't normal just a setting on a dryer? Okay. So what we've learned is that autism is a shared human experience. It becomes part of the fabric of life for all involved. And I know for me, I could speak personally. I mean, it's so integrated in my whole worldview in my life, so integrated in how I raised my son. It's so much a part of who I am that I feel we must express appreciation. It helps us become better people. Another very important point is development is lifespan. There's this notion of window of opportunity closing shut that parents of kids with autism hear all the time. If your child doesn't make so much progress by 5 years of age, basically, you've doomed your child. Well, guess what? It's a total misapplication of the notion of neuroplasticity, okay? And we really, really argue against that. Yes, research indicates that one of about 5 factors that leads to better outcomes is getting started earlier, okay? But we also know that development is lifespan. I've known so many people with autism who just made leaps and bounds of growth in the teen years, even as adults. And we have to hold on to this now because so many parents are terrified when they hear that you must do so many hours of therapy by the time your child is 5 years of age. And my friend Michael John Carley, the man with Asperger's who I spoke about earlier, one of his quotes, "A person with autism is more a product of their life's experiences than their autism." And I think that's very, very important to hold on to because that's the same with us, So, autism is a shared human experience. for educators, families, and those with autism. It's all a part of our lives. A couple of other points, and then we're going to open up for questions. One very nice story. This actually goes back 15 years. Chicago Tribune magazine, a young man named Stanford James, who was passionate about trains. Thomas the Tank Engine. Somebody once said, interest in trains should be a diagnostic criterion for autism. And Stanford was fascinated, passionate about trains, raised by a single mom in city projects in South Chicago, a family living in poverty. And this article spoke about, over many years, what his mother was told. And his mother was told, yeah, they told me I got to put those trains away or I should throw them out because Stanford will never develop, he'll never learn. She goes, he loved them, and I always went along with what he loved and I used it. Well, this is a picture of Stanford in his 20s, an employee of the Chicago Regional Transit Authority. He won Employee of the Year that year because he was the most reliable employee in that organization. And there was a quote from his immediate boss, I love Stanford. He's just so reliable. He never has to check the train schedule on the computer because he's memorized the train schedule. And he doesn't spend a lot of time schmoozing over the water cooler. He needs to come in and work and get his full day of work in. And he always is willing to work a little bit more if I need him. And the most important piece here is the pride. Here is a person with a strong sense of identity who knows who he is. He knows he has autism. And he says, actually in this article, I tell myself in my mind, Stanford, you are the best person you can be. And unfortunately, that's not happening enough for people with autism. So I want to show you a quick video, it's just 2 minutes, of the young man I showed earlier who was hugging me, Justin. And it's a video about Justin talking about his art. Now, Justin was diagnosed with moderate to severe autism when he was young. That wasn't my diagnosis. I kind of confirmed his diagnosis after other people saw him. And his parents really worked on his passion. Initially, it was cartoon characters. Then they had artists work with him, and now he is an artist, and he teaches art to kids with autism, and he teaches art to so-called neurotypical kids. So here's Justin.
I love to do animating and illustrating. I started drawing my concept book since in the fall of 2003. It's the reason I love to draw Sesame Street because it returns to my childhood. Sesame Street, Looney Tunes, Disney, and animals. When I move the apartment, I'll do with my responsibilities. For example, laundry, the dishwasher, take care of my cat. I'm gonna miss my family. I was in a tie, happy and sad. That was a tie. Remember Toy Story 3, Andy Goes to College? The reason Toy Story 3 is a sad movie is because Annie's going to college. It makes audiences sad because of separation and missing. One of the best things about Disney is for all ages. If I draw Disney, that makes everybody very happy. My drawings can be everybody's gifts. My drawings can be everybody's miracles.
Okay, so why a uniquely human perspective? Because a deeper understanding builds trust with people with autism and their families, makes our communities more humane and caring, and makes us all better people. And Justin's boss at the time that this video was made actually said, you know, the fact that Justin's a great artist is a so what to me. The fact that he's an inspiration to every employee of mine is what really counts. Okay, so I think we're okay for some questions now if you have. Yes.
I had a question about schools and teachers, because one of the things that I see, I'm an educational advocate, is that the IEPs, they're almost cookie cutter IEPs for each child with autism, and it makes me crazy that they don't understand the differences between the children. Can you recommend some particular websites that I can give to teachers to understand that not all people with autism are alike and they don't need the same accommodations? And 'cause I'm having a hard time getting them to understand that.
Yes, yes. Yes, the issue, and that is an important issue, there are some approaches, educational approaches in autism, which are kind of one size fits all for all children. We actually have an educational model that's being used in 12 countries now. It's highly individualized. It's a developmentally based model. There actually, a colleague of mine who's from this area, Dr. Karen Levine, who's a psychologist, Karen just came out with a book called Individualized Interventions for Children with Autism. I believe it came out last year. But people are finally moving away from that because more traditional behavioral approaches dominated for so many years based upon operant conditioning approaches. And if you don't look at a person, any person, developmentally, you can't appreciate the learning differences, and you can't appreciate that you have to use different strategies and maybe different teaching modalities to really reach this person. I would say that's probably, in my mind, one of the top 2 or 3 really bad things that happen to people with autism. Getting snapped into a program that is supposed to work because you reinforce the right behaviors and you use the right reinforcers, but it has nothing to do with who that person is in terms of their strengths and their interests.
Or the social pragmatics piece, I'll find that like, well, we're giving him social pragmatics, and it's just a matter of like the child, it's a script for the child. They can do it during lunch bunch or what have you, but they're not having opportunities to practice it in the real world, or, an assumption like, oh, well, just because they have pragmatics, they're going to learn how to, like.
For decades and decades, we've learned that if you teach a child or a person with autism something in one situation, and you only measure progress in that situation, that's not what we call meaningful progress. So I could speak about my model with my colleagues called the CERTS model, which we talk about natural environments with the right supports. And whenever we talk about important goals and objectives to help a child to be a more competent communicator, it's always simultaneously approached across homeschool and community settings. It has to work that way. Unfortunately, the learning style of some people with autism is situation specific. So yes, I could learn to say this or do this Monday, Wednesday, Friday with the speech pathologist in this room. But we have to build in the ability to generalize across many different settings, yes.
Hi, so it was actually nice to see Justin up there. I know him. I'm from New Jersey. I live right outside Montclair.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, so my younger brother has a PDD and OS.
Which is no longer a category.
I know. So that's been a whole other thing. I'm trying to work with that into his IEP and scholastic things, changes from that. But my brother has autism, 2 of my cousins, my grandfather, my uncle, and my aunt. And just seeing the way that my immediate family has approached it as opposed to the family of my cousins. It's completely polar opposite situations, whereas my cousin's family is bought more into the Autism Speaks dialogue as opposed to my family, which is trying to, I do a lot of advocacy work with my brother, who knows he has autism and does a lot of outreach stuff too. Trying to institute person-first language into schools and things like that. So what would you say is the best approach, besides reading your book and attending talks like this, to trying to make people understand the importance of linguistic markers and things when speaking about people with autism?
Well, let me first address that point right away. And I actually do begin the book with this, that I use person-first language, child with autism, person with autism. I'm not militant about it. There are some very prominent, important voices in the field of autism, people with autism now, who say, no, I'm autistic. I'd rather you call me autistic or an autist than call me person with autism, because it's such an inherent part of who I am as a person. Temple Grandin says that. Temple Grandin refers to people with autism as autistics, okay? And she says it's an inherent part of who I am. So I think it really is the preference of the individual as far as that goes. But when you talk about the Autism Speaks perspective, I imagine most of you are familiar with Autism Speaks. It was started by grandparents of a son with autism. He also happened to be, at the time, the CEO of NBC Universal. It's the largest advocacy, quote-unquote, organization in the world. And they've been drifting back towards, a little bit towards, let's really help people with autism every day. Initially, it was all about cure. And the $60, $80 million they raised a year in research, the great majority of it was going towards biomedical research about a cure. And at the same time this was all happening, they had about 80, 100 employees, not one had autism. And actually John Elder Robinson, who I quoted, was invited to be an employee, and he lasted 3 months because he said he couldn't tolerate the way they looked at autism there. But it's the most powerful organization, visibly powerful. You know the lighted up blue, where all these buildings all over the world are lit up blue, from Dubai to, Empire State Building? They're responsible for that. They're changing. As the grandson grows and they see he's not going to be cured, and as things begin to shift a little bit more towards quality of life. But yeah, when you have very loud voices kind of dominating the discussion about autism, it gets away from there are other points of view, like in your family, and how do we teach people about that other point of view? One of the best ways I say right now is what I've done. Listen to people with autism. There are so many voices, so many people right now, so many blogs of extremely thoughtful, articulate people with autism. Many married, have kids, but they're very upfront about their challenges. Some who don't wish ever to be married, and they could talk about that as well. But for me, luckily I met Temple Grandin in the 80s, and I've hosted her many times to speak at our conferences. So I was exposed to people with autism early on, and now I regularly do workshops with people with autism. I'm a sponge. I just soak up every bit of understanding that I can from folks who could talk about their firsthand experience.
Just a quick follow-up question. Why do you think that research organizations and people as a whole have been so, initially at least, adverse to listening to people who have autism? Why has it taken us so long to get to that point?
Yeah, that's a great question. Why has it taken so long to listen to people with autism? For many years, I actually said, when Temple Grandin was pretty much the only voice out there, I said, well, it's wonderful that she's sharing her experience, but when I see people listen to her at a conference, they're more there because she's a curiosity than are they there to really take to heart what she's saying. And I think it still happens when professionals are not exposed to a lot of people with autism. I think it's like, oh my goodness, this person with autism could actually tell me what their emotions are like and their inner world is like. And we have to get beyond that curiosity and say, these are such important, critical voices to help us all understand. Another reason is that a lot of what they say goes against common practices in the field. For years, decades, you had to do eye contact training for people with autism. And now you have dozens of articulate people with autism saying, it's really hard for me to process what you're saying when you make me look at you at the same time. And so they're actually shaming, in some ways, a lot of very well-known people in the field in education and treatment, because what they're saying is the opposite of what these people have prescribed for so many years. So I think there's a little bit of that element as well. As a matter of fact, a number of years ago, and this happened in Boston, at one of the schools for kids with autism, there was a very well-known woman who's now written 5 books, Donna Williams. She's from Australia. She has autism. And she was coming to speak in New England. And she speaks very much against the type of approach that was used in this school in the Boston area. And people sent out all these faxes saying, she's a phony, she really doesn't have autism, don't listen to her. And it's kind of like people just couldn't tolerate that she was a voice speaking against the approach that was used at this school. So, heavy-duty politics in the field.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a speech therapist, and what I've noticed is that the schools are very eager to give out behavioral supports, 20 hours of ABA for our little kids, and not so eager to give out speech therapy. How does that all the enthusiasm towards ABA shape, what you're talking about in terms of behavior and how we look at it, and what should we do to use them and use that support to our benefit?
Yeah. Do we have time for a full-day workshop? First of all, let me just say, when we talk about ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis, there are about 8 different versions, okay? There's very traditional ABA, which we speak up against, and that's sit the child down and drill over and over again, train eye contact, and so forth. There are many very fine behavior analysts who have taken in some of the developmental literature and the individual learning style literature. And actually, I like to say there are some folks in ABA who are closer to what we do than they are to other people within ABA. Okay? So there's been a shift. This area, in particular Massachusetts, New Jersey's another state, very heavily influenced by ABA. Other places of the country, not so much. There definitely is a shift and a change that's happening. And I mean, I could talk to you about this afterwards, but actually our organization, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, just successfully filed a formal complaint to the Federal Department of Education about ABA having too much influence, especially in teaching language and communication. And the Department of Education just released a letter last month saying we need to have all disciplines involved, and that basically applied behavior analysts are not the specialists in all areas in autism. Okay? So people are now saying, wait a second, I believe this, I'm down to my core, a team approach is best. When you have OTs, speech and language pathologists, educators, parents, behavior analysts all working together, and you don't have a hierarchy of one person's calling all the shots. And unfortunately, that creates all kinds of problems when I go to schools and I see that hierarchy in place. It really needs to be a team approach. And I want to emphasize the parents having a very strong voice.
I just wanted to ask about linking to humor and sort of the cognitive basis for humor, and how, if you've worked with that in your particular practice, or
Yes.
It seems like 5 years ago, very few people were talking about it. If I Google it now, I get lots of results.
Yes.
And I wondered if you would address that.
Well, in a way, the whole issue of humor in autism makes us discard one of the kind of the long-standing false beliefs that people with autism don't have a sense of humor. They have a different sense of humor, okay? So people with autism might find humor in word meanings or word play, but not necessarily humor that's deeply embedded in social nuance, if you will, in some cases. But there's actually a project down at the Groden Center in Providence that's led by, oh my goodness, Cooper Woodard, who's a psychologist. And it's a positive psychology approach to autism, where they teach the students with autism to tell jokes and to engage in activities that, and I'm going to move a little bit off of humor now, but that create positive emotion, shared positive emotional experiences. But once you get into humor, if you're talking about humor through language, then that could be challenging for some people on the spectrum. It's one of the things that's really fascinating is people with autism often find humor through nonverbal behavior really engaging. So for example, looking at old silent movies, or I'm going to blank on this now, but there's a comedian, English comedian, and some of his work has been on PBS over the years, and it's almost mime-like. It's purely nonverbal. And a lot of people with autism just find his humor to be the funniest humor in the world because, in a sense, it dances around the linguistic aspect of it.
Hi, our son has been diagnosed on the spectrum very low when he was treated when he was 6. He's now 11, and we'd have chosen not to have an IEP for him. And usually we end up working with the teachers and meeting with them. Invariably, they contact us and it's like, we need to have a sit down. Well, next year he's going to have more than 2 teachers, and there's going to be about 7 of them. And I don't think this approach is going to work anymore. Is there something you can suggest? I mean, I agree with the IEP not being the best route, but at the next year, we won't be able to sit down with 7 teachers.
Right. Yeah.
So,
And, unfortunately, for the challenge you're facing, if you would ask me what is one of the best situations for a student or a child with autism, educational situations, it's when everybody's on the same page. And it's less confusing, be less confusing to your child, and less confusing to you. You know, without knowing specifics, it's hard for me to make any specific suggestions. I will tell you this, that one of my earliest experiences, that was such a wonderful experience, and I'm not saying you need to do this, was a family who had many different people both in and out of school working with their son, and he was 10 or 11 at the time. And what they did was once a month, they would have kind of a potluck dinner over their house and invite everybody over as a way for everybody to relate to each other and truly feel that they're part of a team. That's going to be your major challenge, that people feel connected to each other to share information, and so we could all be on the same page for your son. But if you have people coming from different practices and some from private practice and so forth, again, I don't know the specifics of your situation, what's going to be so important for you to reinforce is that we are part of a team, and certainly using, you know, whether it's bulletin boards, message boards on the internet, and they do have ones that could be secure now, where everybody can communicate with each other and talk about, well, what just worked, you know, in this activity, or what, you know, we're shifting now to some other goals that we're adopting, and so forth.
Do you find it useful to proactively speak to the teachers? You know, to speak to them prior to the school year starting, you know, in that respect?
Absolutely. And, you know, that's referred to by some people as transition planning. And it's actually some of what I do when I consult the schools. When I consult the schools on a regular basis and I go back and I know the people, we start transition planning for some kids as early as April of the school year before, planning for September. Who's going to be the teacher? What visual supports do we want to have to go with the child? And in best case scenario, we have staff from the coming year come to observe the student now, before the transition happens. The more we could make things predictable, not only for a child with autism, but for all the staff, the better it will be come September or August, whenever the school year starts for you. Yeah, so that's important. It's also important to build trust. We speak a lot about professionals and parents building trust together in my book. And that is so important because, as you probably know, sometimes it goes the other way. And you begin to have adversarial relationships and mistrust. And unfortunately, in many cases, it's the family and the child who are the victims of that when it happens. There are some very, very fine professionals also who will bend over backwards, you know, for you. And those are the people they're golden.
Just two suggestions for you. One of the things you can do is like think outside the box. You can contact the school and ask them if they can provide a buddy from the middle school for someone to walk around. The other thing you can do is ask if your child can visit the school beforehand and see what the teachers are, just all to do, you know, help with the comfort level.
Good parts of transition planning. So thank you very much. We are out of time, and I hope this was interesting and helpful for you. Thanks.